The Misfits.
So yeah, my name is Darryl Owens. Most people do call me by my initials, D.O. I grew up in Barberton, Ohio, and graduated from high school. Went to Bowling Green State University initially to play football. After my third year at Bowling Green, I ended up transferring to Walsh University, which is in North Canton, Ohio. And at this point in time, I'm not a believer. Again, I'm in college just to play football. Having to go to class is just one of those things you got to do in order to play. So I'm willing to do that and do just enough to be eligible. But again, I'm not a believer. My focus and my mindset is on one thing and one thing only, and that's football. But when I was at Walsh, I ended up meeting a teammate, Antoine Benet, and he was a running back, and he was a believer. And through that relationship, I ended up hearing about Christ in detail. And I had heard, of course, about Jesus prior to that, whether it was at Bowling Green, growing up in Barberton, going to church here and there. So I definitely had heard about Christ up until that point. But it was in meeting Antoine that I really got to truly hear about the gospel. And small conversations at practice, small conversations on the way and from football games ended up leading to a full blown out Bible study that we were doing on campus. And it started with him and me, and it ended up growing till about, we were getting 30, 40, 50 people every week coming out for Bible study. And it was through that process that I did come to know Christ, and that I made an intentional choice to follow Christ and his teachings and really set out to get the gospel out. Once I graduated, at that point in time, I had been going to Deliverance Christian Church, and Sarge, I met Sarge at Deliverance. Again, Antoine had taken me to Deliverance, but I met Sarge, and Sarge one day had said, he said, stop at Hartford Middle School, and I don't know what we're gonna do. We just gonna let the Spirit lead us, and we'll figure it out from there. So I stopped by, and it was exactly how he said. We just allowed for God to move and send us students and situations, and before you know it, that once a week showing up at Hartford turned into me showing up every day, which eventually turned into me working in an after-school program. And that was really my introduction to education. And from there, in working in education, mixing that with ministry really put me on the path that I'm on today, to where God has called me to work with kids, and he's given me a passion for education. So in my ministry, I mix education with the gospel, and that's my focal point.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Ministry Misfits. We are on episode 2 of season 5. We are kind of in our first normal episode of the season. It's not really, because as I'm doing this, we've actually already been live for a while over on Twitch. This is a live recording that we're doing. But Darryl Owens is back with me for the first time since, well, actually, I'm not so sure. I don't remember if you were our first interview or if it was Deshaun, but you may have actually been the first ever live interview we did.
I'll take it.
Back in season 1. And now you're here doing the first live interview of season 5 also. The last time we talked to Dio, we were doing a live broadcast of a basketball tournament there at the Martin Center, where I think we talked to you right after you got eliminated. So hopefully you're in a little bit of a better mood today than you were then. But we're talking with Dio, and specifically though this time the conversation is it's a little bit different, because we decided to do this about a week ago after there was some interesting discussions going on in Dio's comment section over on Facebook. So, Dio, why don't we start with this? Give everybody a rundown of what it was that you actually posted and what your questions were and everything like that.
If I remember right, I know we were talking about critical race theory, and I'm real big on history. I'm real big on accurate history. My favorite type of history is centered around Black history, transatlantic slave trade, early colonialism, Reconstruction, and all of that. So just in doing some readings and things like that, I came across just some different arguments of people speaking against critical race theory. And for the life of me, it just didn't make sense. So I then took that question and I proposed it to Facebook, just asking the question or really making a statement of, I'm yet to understand what people's issue is with CRT, with critical race theory. And then from there, just these different conversations and dialogues ended up happening throughout the comment section.
Yeah, so for those that are not familiar with Dio, my introduction to him was, I don't even know how long ago it was now, man. But
it was, wow.
The way he was introduced to me is, this is one of the most brilliant educators within the state of Ohio, if not wider range. He's an award-winning educator. He has done multiple education projects of different types and teaching and all this other stuff. Education is his thing. If you didn't get that from his testimony, education is the holy discontent, all of it. So when somebody like that asks the question of why are people freaking out, it's worth taking note that an educator is asking the question, because it's not just because he's curious. There's also going to be a lesson behind it. And that's kind of where the comments ended up going.
Yeah.
Was a very large history lesson started to come out of the comment section. So we'll start with this, because this was something that you had said you actually hadn't really been familiar with. It's something that listeners to Misfits should be somewhat familiar with the CRT discussion, is why actually people do have a problem when we start to talk CRT is largely due to miseducation.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, we get into things like Christopher Rufo, a well-known right-winger who is very much anti-public school. And his entire goal, stated by him, is to try to get rid of public education and back into private Christian home-based educations and homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
He is the one that initially started this whole idea of, well, CRT is being taught in schools. CRT is trying to, blame white people for everything, and they're going to make your children feel horrible and all these other things. When Antoine Malone was on back in season 1, we broke down exactly what CRT is and that that's not actually the case. But for a refresher, because you gave a very good lesson on it over there in Facebook, there's a lot of problems with that, particularly being the fact that the claim is that it's being taught in schools.
Mm-hmm.
It can't actually be taught in elementary schools. It's not really able to be taught. Even in some college cases, it's not even able to be taught. Right. What is actually what we're talking about when we say CRT?
The easiest way that I explain it to people is critical race theory is the theory, the belief that race is, specifically racism, is seen throughout American society. It's seen in all of America's systems, more specifically America's legal system. Derek Bell is a good person to refer to. A lot of people call him the father of critical race theory. Another big name is Richard Delgado is a big name. And there's other people. And even as you study critical race theory, you even come across people who they are really big on the topic of racism and Black liberation, but they're not necessarily critical race theorists. They just study the topic. So a lot of times people that speak against critical race theory, they'll go and they'll quote from people who are not even critical race theorists and put it underneath that umbrella of CRT. And that's just a part of the misrepresentation and the propaganda that I think is surrounding the topic of CRT. But again, CRT is when you say racism is implemented in all of American society, in all of America's systems, specifically America's criminal justice system.
Yeah, you know, the way that we explained it before is this idea of it is a legal analysis tool. Is the I think the most technical terms to use for it without getting even more technical and using language that's Latin. You know, it's a legal analysis tool. It looks at laws, it looks at the impact of those laws, and it looks at it as far as the intersection between economics, the intersection with race, the intersection with gender studies. All these things intertwine, and CRT specifically is looking at the fact that all of those different categories, race plays the biggest impact into how these laws are affecting people. That's all it is. It's an analysis tool. The fear behind it is much more being directed by, and this was the other thing which I actually personally was shocked to see you say. I haven't actually heard of this before, but maybe it was just the wording that was used. The fear behind it comes from those that are putting out the Great Replacement theory, which, for those that don't know what that is, this is there's no other way to describe it. It's a white supremacist theory that has been around for a long time. But it is the idea that other races are trying to replace white dominance, and in some cases, the most extreme will say, and do so in a way that will enslave white people as a result.
Exactly.
There is no actual evidence that there is any great conspiracy behind this.
Right.
But this is what has driven a lot of fear-based conspiracy policies for the past 100 years, and not just in the U.S. This is also part of what the initial conspiracy that you had within Germany was to get rid of the Jews within Nazi Germany, was a replacement theory. You had the same thing going on within Russia, or in the Soviet Union and in the Slavic areas. There's always been these kind of ideas of, well, the dominant party has to stay dominant, and so there's going to be an uprising, and so we've got to take care of that uprising before it becomes an uprising.
Yeah, you see that in the Bible. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So with the Israelites in Egypt.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and that's exactly what it was. You have a Pharaoh that arises to power that doesn't remember Joseph, doesn't remember why the people are even there, but is fearful over the fact that they think there is going to be an eventual uprising that takes them out and wipes them out, and they are no longer going to be the driving force of power within the world. It's a very human way of thinking. It's a survivalist way of thinking.
Right.
But again, there's no actual evidence that any of that is happening.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, the buzzword of CRT has kind of dropped off the radar over the past 3 or 4 years. And it was replaced by another 3 letters, DEI. So explain to us what DEI is.
Diversity, equity, inclusion is just simply saying that we want, as a country, to diversify the spaces that we find ourselves in, and we want to reach out to people who would normally not have those opportunities and give them an opportunity But a lot of people like to say, well, we're giving people opportunities that are not qualified. No, that's not what DEI is saying. DEI is saying is we're reaching out to people that are qualified that wouldn't normally get those opportunities. And we're trying to put them in those spaces to represent, again, groups and demographics that would normally not be represented.
Yeah, it's very telling because, again, that last thing you just said actually is part of why we know that the fear of DEI is coming out of the same replacement theory. Is it's this idea of, well, with DEI, they're going to replace qualified candidates with unqualified candidates that just happen to not be white.
Right.
The problem comes in with the first part of that statement is, again, there's no evidence that this kind of thing is happening. Mm-hmm. This is the closest thing they can come to, so that's why they grab onto it.
Yep.
But it's also saying that the only qualified candidates are white.
Exactly.
That alone should be enough for us to be able to say, okay, this is definitely built out of racism.
Yeah.
But for some reason, it's still not enough. So as we progress through, one of the things that came up with all this stuff with DEI CRT is that the claim was that I'm trying to think of which claim to go with first to get us in the right direction here, because there were a lot. We'll start with this one. The first claim with that was this idea that it has never been a better time for non-white people in America. That was the claim that was given because they claimed there was no more slavery, all this other stuff, and that DEI was unnecessary because everything is already good enough. Walk us through your response there. We're not going to read the whole response because it was very long, even though everybody should go find it and read it because it was very poetic and right to the point and educational, which is what we expect from Dio. But walk us through the problem with that question, first of all, but then also what the response actually is.
Yeah, I think one of the frustrating things about 2025 and people being given a platform to say just about whatever they want is that people don't have to educate themselves before they actually speak. And there's a lot of people speaking on the topic, specifically the topic of race and racism, who they just haven't done their homework. So when you say that it's a good time or the best time for non-white people, or in this conversation that we were having, he was referencing Black people specifically, this is the best time to be Black. Because we no longer have those barriers that we used to have. And to say that lets me know that a person doesn't really know the history of the country. They don't really know the history of the Black experience. And they don't know how a lot of these issues linger on generation after generation after generation. So when you talk about from a timeline standpoint, slavery being quote unquote abolished in 1865, yeah, it is abolished in 1865, but there's still this clause in the 13th Amendment that allows for slavery to be legal if a person is convicted of a crime. So through Black codes, you still have Black people being targeted and imprisoned and being enslaved again. And that clause is still present today. There's a lot of different events that I could talk about throughout Reconstruction. You have the Freedmen's Bank, to where the newly freed Black population had put millions of dollars into this bank through their accounts, and that bank ended up going under as a result of the mismanagement of money through the white management of the bank. So you finally get in a position to where you are free and you are able to accumulate wealth, and then everything that you have, you put into this bank, and then you end up losing it all. After Reconstruction, after 1877, after, again, the Freedmen's Bank going under, you have all of these different situations, and I'm talking about over 50 situations to where Black people establishing themselves, establishing cities and thriving economically, and white mobs coming in and burning down these cities. So from that standpoint, you got to start over. But as we go through time, you get that through the earliest 20th century. You get that through the mid 20th century, up to the 60s, the 70s. I mean, every decade, all the way up until 225, we could talk about the different things that have happened as a result of the mentality of an oppressive administration and an oppressive, I would say, country population that we've had since 1865. So, yes, it looks different, definitely. People are right when they say it looks different, but even though it looks different, it doesn't mean that at the heart of it all, underneath all of those layers, that things are different. I like to, one of my favorite educators or historians is Dr. Amos Wilson, and he talks about how there's always the same constants. On the surface, it might look different, but you have these constants that continually remain the same. And when you look at history on the surface, it looks different. You see Black people walking around, no chains on, we're not on plantation, so it looks different. But if you really look with your eyes, if you really look with your heart, if you really look through educating yourself, you'll see that those same constants remain, and there's still those same barriers that we were facing during slavery.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there as far as where we're going to go. The first place I want to go is something that you had said as far as where that question comes out of is a lack of education.
Mm-hmm.
I think we may need to change it to it's a lack of research and miseducation.
Mm-hmm. Willful ignorance.
Yeah, because the unfortunate thing, and this is part of what the bigger conversation we're going to get into here in a little bit is that part of the reason we have these kinds of long-lasting conspiracies, long-lasting, systemic racism, long-lasting systemic supremacy, all these sort of things happening is because of the way that we talk about history in general within the United States. And so in some cases, it's not necessarily that they aren't educated, it's that they aren't actually educated in the facts. They're educated in the propaganda.
Right.
And, this is something that goes beyond just this discussion. This is something, especially for believers, this is something that we need to make sure that we are doing right. I was just having this discussion with somebody before we went on air. And Joel Bowman and I have been talking about for a while also is that, right now we are finally seeing a time where we finally are seeing people that have been telling guys like Joel and I that we were nuts and crazy for calling Christian nationalism out. Mm-hmm. They're finally saying, oh, it's real, and now we're going to call it out as evil, but they haven't done the work to know why. They're seeing the results. They know the results are bad, but they don't understand why. Mm-hmm. And so they are pushing against it, but they're pushing with a theology that has not been educated and has not been decolonized.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are pushing just a different form of a white supremacist and a white Jesus onto the conversation rather than actually dealing with the problem.
Mm-hmm. It's a good assessment.
And that's what we have going on with a lot of this stuff as well, is we have not done the work. The whole CRT discussion, whenever we get into it, one of the things that comes back is, well, you don't actually know what it is. You're just listening to the propaganda machines. And so the question I ask, have you read Derek Bell?
Mm-hmm.
They come back saying, who's that? I've read Derek Bell. That's part of the reason why I feel like I can actually engage in the discussion is I've read Derek Bell. I know what the source material is.
Mm-hmm.
But when you haven't done the work, you don't know what it is that you're actually addressing or even what it is that you're saying when you're making some of these arguments.
From your perspective, can you talk about for you in your own personal experience what the work looks like? So for a person that's watching that's saying, okay, I haven't done the work, but I want to do the work, like what does it look like to do the work?
Part of it is sitting down with guys like you and talking I mean, that is part of it. When we were in Cleveland, specifically, a little bit when we were in Canton before that, a little bit while we were in college, it was a little bit of a different. It was all there, I now know, but it was so far into the service that we didn't recognize it in terms of a different culture in the way that all of these kind of discussions could happen. It was not nearly as angry, heated, political as it is now. It was still angry and political, but there were places where it could actually happen in a good way.
Yeah.
2016 is the first time where I started to see the fact that the dividing lines between let's have a discussion and let's make this an actual political thing, those that were angry political were all coming from the white side, not from the black side.
Mm-hmm.
I was lucky enough that I've always had good relationships and networks of a wide diversity of other theologians and pastors.
Yeah.
I mean, we are lucky enough to be within the Third Street system to where, I mean, we know the Tribe Collective is a wide range of pastors of all walks of life that we have access to talk to. We live in a city that is very diverse in good ways, but also in bad ways. So we see both, all these sort of things. And so it was having discussions with people, actually going back and looking up some of this stuff. And then when we were in Cleveland in 2018, 2019, watching the reactions in the city to things.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most, the weirdest experiences was realizing that I was one of the only white pastors in that area of Cleveland. But not just that, I was the only white pastor living in that area of Cleveland. There were other white pastors kind of doing work there, but outside of the Catholic priests who actually lived in the church, nobody else was even wanting to live in the area because they were scared of the area. But they were still coming to do ministry in the area. How can that work? And so things like that, where it was just allowing myself to actually live with people, experience people, talking to people, hearing people out. And when 2020 hit and the protests broke out, and you have all of these pastors that are saying, well, look, this is a problem. You need to condemn Black Lives Matter if you're really a Christian, because they're all just terrorists, all this other stuff. I'm looking at it and looking at the people I've been working with, and it's like, from a purely materialistic mindset, destruction of property as a result to a system that has told people they are property and them destroying property is actually a good response. That's a direct retaliation response. Why are we surprised that this is what is coming out? And I contacted our good friend James Talbert. And I was like, hey, I need to know if I'm thinking clearly or not. What is going on? And he on the phone, he's like, Fouts, stop asking me and just do it.
Just do. There you go.
Because he said, you have been living in these communities. You have been talking. You have done the work. Now go out and do it. And that's part of the reason why within Misfits, we focus in a lot on these kind of discussions, and we always try to have a wide diverse of guests. It's not DEI reason we have guests like Dio on. It's because Dio is the expert here. Like, why would I not want him to teach me? And why would I not want to elevate his voice? That at least for me has been a lot of what the work has been. And then in doing that, from the theology standpoint, it has also been the more that I have been able to see where there have been white supremacy type stuff having hold on me, I'm able to recognize, well, this is stuff that I was being told was biblical.
Yeah.
So let's actually look at what Scripture says. Let's read the original. Let's read outside of the publishers that I was told were the correct publishers.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, I was able to see, okay, this is why. And I mean, that ultimately, that's why we ended up with the Cold War theology stuff that we did, is that in doing that, we find this has been going on for a long, long time. And it's built out of the same theories that we're hearing people use to crash down CRT, to destroy DEI. And it's just accepted as fact.
Right.
Because we've been told it's fact.
Right. And because people want it to be fact. For it to be the opposite, yeah, people have an issue with that. It's not in alignment with their ideologies. It's not in alignment with their lifestyle. So they want the things that aren't true to be facts.
Yeah. It's convenient.
Yeah.
It's convenient.
Yep.
It's comfortable.
Yep.
And this is part of the reason why, because we hear people also ask, why are you spending time talking about this stuff instead of talking about the gospel? This is a gospel issue. This right here is a gospel issue, largely because of the fact that we are called to not seek out comfort. Comfort is not the goal. We don't grow out of comfort. We can't disciple out of comfort. The gospel is uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And so why are we seeking out comfort?
And I think that's kind of even in alignment with, it makes me think of Christian nationalism when you talk about discomfort, and not even just Christian nationalism. Like a lot of my conversations with white people, I think there's this guilt and there's this shame and there's this uncomfortable feeling. And rather than address that guilt, that shame, and that uncomfortable feeling, it's just easy to say the thing that's making me feel guilty is wrong. And let me walk away from that and let me fight against that, versus embracing it, being intentional about, hey, let me explore and see what this is about, and then navigating through it as the scriptures tell us to. But yeah, a lot of people feel uncomfortable and they feel like the thing that's making them feel uncomfortable is wrong. And then when they find other people that say it's wrong, it's just easy to jump on it versus doing your homework.
Well, and you know, I'll ask you this, and I already know the answer, but we'll ask it anyway. You aren't out there trying to make people feel uncomfortable, right?
You said, am I out here trying to make people feel uncomfortable?
Right. You're not out there trying to make people feel uncomfortable.
No, but I know it's going to happen.
Yeah, we know it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But that's not the intent. And that's
not right.
And that's part of where the issue comes in, is that we keep hearing over and over and over from people saying that, you know, those of us that are talking about this stuff are out there just trying to guilt trip white people.
Right. Which
I always find hilarious when I have people say that to me, because it's like, do you not see my complexion? But the bigger question, though, for the church outside of society, because the unfortunate thing is society is going to society. We know that. But for us as a church, when you are feeling shame and discomfort, we know it naturally we want to run away from it. But if you are a believer, shame and discomfort should only be coming from one place. Why are you trying to take conviction, which is something that we preach as something we're supposed to be feeling, and making it into some political idol that you think you have to destroy just to actually uphold your own idols?
That's a good word right there.
Now,
that's a word.
Here's the next part of the discussion, because we can talk about how, like, the process I went through. We can talk about the process that we want to see other people go through. But there's a bigger systemic issue still at play, and that is the fact that a lot of this is coming from the way that we talk and teach history, and even the way that we organize our schools here within the United States. Mm-hmm. This is part of the reason, besides the fact that you were the one that brought it up, more than anybody else, you're the one I want to have this specific part of the discussion with you being such a decorated educator and expert within the world of education. white supremacy and education is a huge piece of American history that is not talked about enough.
Mm-hmm.
So let's walk through what it is we're actually dealing with here as to why it is that people don't actually know this stuff. To start with, we'll go with well, we'll let you decide how you want to start it out, because there's so many different layers to this, and we can start at any one of them and get to the other ones. So let's just start the conversation. White supremacy and education. What are we dealing with?
So, man, when you talk about the history of Black people in America and striving to be educated, we all know there were literacy laws during enslavement to where Black people weren't allowed to read. It was illegal to be able to read. It was illegal to learn how to write. It was illegal to congregate for the purpose of any type of academic instruction. What I love about education is it raises a person's expectations. What you thought you wanted for your life, once you educate yourself, those expectations go up. In your current situation, you're no longer satisfied with that. Frederick Douglass talks about it in his autobiography, and he talks about how his owner's wife initially started to teach him how to read, and the owner intervened and pretty much says to the wife, once you start to educate him, he will no longer be satisfied with being a slave. This is why we don't educate Black people, because once we do so, they're no longer fit to be slaves. So when you talk about education in America, specifically for Black people, I do believe there is an intentional plan to miseducate, because the goal is to keep Black people oppressed. That's just the reality of the history of America, and we see it today. But white supremacy is definitely aiming to miseducate the Black population. There's great books like The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter Woodson. He talks about it in detail. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about it. I mean, just history is talking about the topic. But one of the big things during Black History Month, a lot of people like to point to Booker T. Washington. And I think MLK, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, these are some of the historical Black figures that people highlight during Black History Month. And Booker T. Washington is also one of those people. And in the Black community, specifically during the time Booker T. Washington was alive, the Black population had a really big issue with Booker T. Washington. They called him Uncle Tom. They called him a lot of different things because they felt like he wasn't really fighting for the Black population. Booker T. Washington went to the Hampton Institute, and he learned under Samuel Armstrong. And Samuel Armstrong, during the industrial era, he was pushing for a certain type of education, but he didn't want Black people to receive what they will call a liberal education. He wanted Black people to learn how to work in the house, learn how to work in the field. And once he had Booker T. Washington underneath him, Booker T. Washington took that message and he took it out to the Black population. But people like specifically W.E.B. Du Bois was against it because they knew that this education that's being spread throughout the country at that moment is only meant to sustain the racial hierarchy in the country. So W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the first people who was really fighting for Black people to receive an education that would elevate them from a mental standpoint. But fast forward to 2025, I do believe that that's what you see. I think what was happening fresh after the Black population was emancipated in 1865 during Reconstruction. I believe that what you see then, when you look at 2025, is part of the reason why you have the current achievement gap in America between Black people and all of the other demographics in America.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of knowledge as power has always been there. You know, that has always been the thing. And, you know, this even goes back into the discussions we've had with slaveholder theology and everything else. Even the idea of reading just because they would be able to understand that what they were teaching them theologically was wrong was enough to keep them under their thumb. You know, it has always been there. As we move through, the thing that keeps coming back is this idea of in reality, it's actually the opposite of what people claim DEI is doing. Is ultimately what it is. You know, it's this idea of, well, if they aren't educated, then they can't take our place.
Right.
And so the longer we keep them uneducated, the more, and in reality, what it does is it shows our own, well, I just lost the word, our own insecurity of our own ignorance. We know we aren't good enough. And so we have to make other people less in order to make ourselves feel better. We're back to comfort. We're back to all these other things. Now, as we move through history and everything else, we have different things that come up. So one of the things you talked about was just the fact that within enslavement, it was just, we don't educate them or else they're going to rise up. Slavery gets abolished, quote unquote. We move into Reconstruction, Jim Crow. We still are seeing a gap because now we're into segregation and everything else. Let's walk through that a little bit because it becomes a little bit complicated because this is the same discussion we have when we talk about white flight and everything else.
Yeah.
What's the deal with segregation as far as education? Because there's a couple of different layers, and I'll eventually hit on the theology, religious layer as we go through. But walk us through the history layer first of what's going on when we're dealing with segregation in education.
Well, with segregation in education, and MLK talked about it heavily. A lot of people, they hear the I Have a Dream speech, but they hear specific clips of it, but they don't listen to the whole speech in its entirety, and they don't listen really to his other speeches or the different things that he wrote. But he talks about the reason that he wanted to integrate with the white population is because he wanted access to the resources. He didn't want to just simply integrate for the sake of integrating. He talks about he's seen societies integrate without power, but he wants to integrate, get the resources, and get the power. So from an education standpoint, the issue with segregation is that the Black schools didn't have the resources needed in order to properly educate its students. They didn't have the facilities. Transportation was an issue. Paying teachers were an issue. Curriculum was an issue. Heather Andrea Williams wrote a really good book. It's called Self-Taught. And she teaches how a lot of people think that Black people during this time were just relying on the government to provide money for education. But when you look at the actual documentation, it shows that these communities, these Black communities, were giving more money to their own education than the government was giving them. But even after giving their all, even after literally everything that they've worked for up until that point, investing that into the education, and sometimes investing into an education for people that investing into an education to where you were never going to see the benefits of it. You're 70 and you're giving everything that you have for the younger generation. But after all of this money was given and after all of these resources, land was signed over and given to the government so the government could build these schools. After all of that, they still didn't have everything that they needed to thrive. And while that was happening, the things that they were building, the things that they were being successful at, Again, these white mobs, and whether it was the police, the government, the FBI, or whoever you want to talk about, over time, they've always come into these communities and destroyed what it is that they were building. So the belief that integration could help give resources of what they were striving for. But even with that happening, of course, we still see issues with that.
So we got a question that just came in that deals with this a little bit. So this is from our good friend Mustache, although he's about to rebrand. So Geo, shout out to Geo. Go follow him on Twitch if you're out there. He asked, does this affect, in your opinion or fact, the way people see themselves? And specifically, we're dealing with back to the question that we were dealing with before, as far as others have to be better, or if others are better, I'm less, and all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think you bring up a couple of things that, again, we still see, even though people don't necessarily recognize it as the same thing. Even when we were talking about education back in the early 1900s, we're dealing with this myth of the fact that Black people only want the government handouts.
Right.
It's
right.
reliance on the government. They can't do what I do, and so they must just be looking for handouts, and that's where you get the stereotypes of lazy and all these other things.
Mm-hmm.
It does, I would say, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but eventually when you are told that you're worthless enough, it is going to affect the way you see yourself.
Definitely so. And that's the whole Brown versus Board. When you look at Brown versus Board, obviously that's the case that people go to when talking about segregation or desegregation. But a lot of people don't know. And again, MLK talks about it. He talks about the work that Dr. Kenneth Clark did in the Brown versus Board case. And Dr. Kenneth Clark is a Black psychologist who him and his wife did the doll experiment. And he talks about during that case how segregation affects how Black people see themselves because of the constant oppression that they face throughout segregation. So Dr. Kenneth Clark and what he brought to the Brown versus Board case was a really critical and significant part that led to segregation being seen as or being illegal. So yeah, it definitely affects the way that people see themselves.
And this is part of where I wasn't sure how we were going to get into it, but I guess now we can get into it. You run into those of us that are in these kind of discussions a lot. You run into people that will quote people like Thomas Sowell or Candace Owens.
Man,
or
so love it.
How do we address these sort of things? Because this is part of the problem, is we're dealing with this exact mindset of, I've been told this over and over and over. And so because of that, in order for me to get myself on top, I have to say the same things. At least from, not necessarily the same things, but at least I have to address it from the same attitude.
Mm-hmm.
So how it gets very awkward for me when this part of the conversation comes up, because normally if I say this, there's like, well, you can't say that because you're denying a Black person's experience. We're going to take away that option for people to dismiss it now.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do with those sort of things? How do we actually address these kind of things where you have voices that are going to promote the status quo in order for them to be able to get ahead? How do we actually go about dealing with it?
For me, I like to point to other sources. I'm not opposed to pointing to Thomas Sowell as a source. But if we're pointing to him as an economist, then we also need to point to Dr. Claude Anderson. We also need to point to Dr. Joanza Kunjufu. The Republican Party, in my experience, specifically white Republicans, and Malcolm X talked about it too, how the white population will always look to put a black face in front of the TV screen that is sharing the same message that they're sharing, to validate what it is that they're also trying to get across. And that's what Thomas Sowell is. That's what Candace Owens is. That's what these people are. But for me, I like to bring up these other sources that people can go to and just simply asking the question, have you read Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu's work? Have you read Dr. Claude Anderson's work? Most of the time, 99.99% of the times, they haven't. So the follow-up question is there a reason that you're only reading from this specific person? Yeah. And of course, there's a reason.
And it ultimately is the same. Normally, the way that I try to get to it is I go the theology route, which is what I always do. But it's the same reason why we end up with, one of the pieces that I wrote back a couple years ago was on the whole idea of why I left the idea of cessationism and complementarianism behind. And part of what I discovered as I was doing these kind of conversations, doing these kind of work before Misfits even started up, when we were doing this kind of stuff just from a pastoral perspective and shepherding the people well, was that the history of these kind of movements were steeped in theology that was written by people that were holding slaves, that were needing to maintain power, that were needing for status quo within the country to stay the same. And then when I look at it and compare it to other places around the world where you have other theologians happening, but they're not Western educated, we're told, well, you can't deal with them. Well, why can't we deal with them? We can't deal with them because prophecy doesn't exist anymore. So if they're not educated, they don't actually know what Scripture says. So you got to trust us. And we say that God had two different ideas in mind when he created man.
Right.
Ignoring the fact that the African theologians had been doing this longer than the Europeans. And same thing when we get into the idea with women or anything else. Why is it that women are not allowed to preach if they can be prophets? Well, they can't be prophets anymore because prophecy doesn't exist. Well, why doesn't prophecy exist anymore? Because if prophecy exists, then the women can speak. And we have to acknowledge that everything we've been saying about the status of the African is wrong.
Yep.
And so it's much easier for us to say, no, there's no more prophecy, and everybody that's not a white male has to keep their mouth shut.
Yeah.
Because it's about status. It's not actually about reality. It's about maintaining status.
Yep. And I would even add, even kind of going back to the question of does it affect how people see themselves? I think when we talk about racism, we're constantly talking about how Black people are the victim in all of this. But I also like to talk about how white people are also the victim in it. So when you ask the question, does it affect the way that people see themselves? Segregation definitely affected the way that white people see themselves because they seen themselves in a higher light. They were born into this world that told them to think higher of themselves than they should. We see Paul talk about that, to not think too highly of yourself. So when you're born into a world like that, it makes it very, very difficult to see things the other way, especially when you don't have to see things the other way. Your life in your mind is not negatively affected by doing things the way you've been doing it for centuries. So yes, Black people are on the negative end of racism, but I would also argue that white people, and maybe even more, are also on the negative end of racism.
Yeah, and it gets into, and this is where again we hear this is heresy comments all the time whenever we start talking about this, but this is part of the reason why we see the gospel Jesus addresses society the way he does within the gospels. Those that are oppressed are blessed. Like Chris said, they will be fine. They are going to be able to get this. They're going to understand this. Like, this makes sense to them. It's woe to the oppressors because they have way more to lose.
Yeah.
And are not likely to actually let go.
Yep.
You know, it's not just about, oh, well, it's the physical oppression here that makes it that that affects it. It's also the fact that it's going to change the way that we think about ourselves, even in terms of how God views us. And it's it also makes it much harder if you're claiming that only my image is what God made his image in, that means I have to work extra hard not to damage it.
Exactly.
It changes the dynamics, but it doesn't change it in a positive way by any means.
Yep.
And that actually does lead us into the other part of this, because this also gets into the current discussions around school choice and Department of Education and private schools and everything else. The history of schooling in the U.S. is complicated, just like everything is. Yeah. Originally, the first schools in the U.S. were all private and mostly all religious. I mean, that's just the way it was, because that was mostly who was here.
Right.
Then we have the creation of the Department of Education and public schooling. But it's segregated. And it's segregated for the reasons that Dio already brought up. It's segregated because if it's not segregated, we don't maintain status quo. But then Brown v. Board comes along. And now all of a sudden, we are starting to see schools desegregate. Well, something happens when we start to see schools desegregate, is we start to see private Christian academies start to pop up all throughout the South and even parts in the North. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, because I want to make sure I say this off the bat. We're not talking necessarily all Christian schools in existence right now.
Right.
We are talking specifically about Christian schools, whether we're talking elementary or middle school or high school or even college, that were founded 1960 into 1975, 8-year range is pretty much what we are addressing here. Were created specifically to be able to enforce their own segregation still legally. Right. And this is where it gets complicated, because we talked about within the Cold War theology stuff about how, you know, the evangelical right politicized scripture and politicized prayer and everything going back into the 1920s with I just lost the court case with the Scopes monkey trial. You've got it again when you get into the thing about prayer in the schools. We don't talk about as much the fact that the Christian right was doing the same thing when it came to Brown v. Board.
Right.
We don't talk about it as much as the fact that they responded similarly to how they did with all these others to Brown v. Board. Why do you think it is that we... and this is something that even talking to, you know, black church history historians, black historians, pastors, that this part of the story just kind of gets overlooked. And the fact that a lot of what we call Christian education in the U.S. was a direct response to desegregating public schools.
Right.
Why do you think that is? Why do we miss that?
Why do we miss, when you say why do we miss that being the history, the historical aspect of it?
Well, the historical aspect, but just the fact that it happened. You know, it doesn't get talked about as much as these other places within American history, at least with a lot of the people that I've talked with. It doesn't get talked about very much. We talk about other things, but the idea of a Christian institution being a direct result of desegregation gets missed, or at least not brought up?
I honestly believe, and this is me trying to see the best in people.
Yeah.
I just believe that some people don't know. What I love about hearing you speak is, you know, your history. You're a historian. So you're aware. Your perspective comes from the information that you have. A lot of people just don't know the information, and you can't bring up something that you just don't know. For the limited amount of people that do know, to bring up that information speaks against, again, your ideologies, or it makes you uncomfortable, or whatever the situation may be. So a percentage of that group that does know, they intentionally try to hold on to that information and not bring it up, because again, it goes against their ideologies. But that's why the education is just so critical. I'm trying to get myself into a space to where, in my conversations about not just race, not just theology, but whatever it may be, I'm not going into it with an argumentative spirit, but I'm going into it with a educator's hat on. Because when you're arguing and it's debating, it's not possible for people to receive what it is that you're actually saying. Versus going into the situation, and I'm really trying to get to a space where I'm just asking questions.
Yeah.
I want to ask questions and figure out, what do you know about this topic? And then I'm hoping that in asking those questions, after you've continuously said, well, I don't know the answer, you end up realizing that you don't know as much as you thought that you knew on the topic. And now, hey, let me go back to the drawing board. So again, in referencing what you said, yeah, I just think that people don't know, and they're just not able to bring some of this stuff up.
Well, and that's why, you know, I both in person and online, I get a lot of people get annoyed when we have these kind of discussions with me, because I even when I am in a teaching, like in a classroom setting, I'm very Socratic method. That has always been my go-to. Even as a student, that was always much more my way, because I realized early on that we know more than we realize. And it's not until we actually are asked questions and have to answer those questions that we realize how much we actually do know, or at least how much we've seen.
Right.
And you know, that's part of the thing that comes up, is either we see people that will finally admit, I have no idea, or they go the other route and they can't admit they don't know. And when you can't admit you don't know, and you're backed into a corner and pride has to take over, eventually, you know, was the proverb, you know, the mouth speaks the heart.
Yeah.
And we see it. You know, we unfortunately see a lot of times when we get into these discussions and we ask specific questions, eventually it's going to come out the fact that, well, it is actually just the way that I view people of color. It's the way that I view women. It's the way that I view immigrants. It's the way that I view, you know, whatever the discussion is. It comes out. Because when you don't have the miseducation to stand on anymore, and you haven't done the work, I mean, it's you know, going back to the imagery, Jesus, it's sinking sand, right?
Yeah.
And when you are scared and sinking, the fear finally is going to come out.
Right.
And this is part of the problem that we are seeing when we have these kind of discussions with the current administration. It's fear-driven on miseducation, and when they are pressed, whether it's pressed by, you know, the Senator Green, whether it's pressed by the press, whether it's pressed by other countries, it's fear and hatred and confusion that comes out.
Right.
Because when the education isn't there, and especially for us as believers, when it's built off of fear of losing and not a desire for truth, there's nothing left.
And that's the scary part about it, to where we're saying a lot of people just don't know. What's scary is, even when they do find out, even when they do get exposed to the truth, their pride, their selfishness, the ideologies that they want to hold on to, even when they do get the truth, they're willing to throw the truth to the side or ignore the truth or say the truth is not the truth because they're not willing to give up what it is that they've been holding on for so long. So yeah, education is the answer. But the scary part is I feel like even the education for a lot of people is still not going to be enough.
Yeah. And, you talked about before as we were going through and I was writing it down, you talked about the fact that, part of the problem with integration in terms of what people were saying the problem was that it was going to be resources and power structures. And the thought process was, well, there wasn't enough resources. So we're not going to do it, or we shouldn't do it because we don't have enough resources. You can't share power. And so there's no reason to do all these other things. And the unfortunate thing is it's the same. Well, there's two things with this. One of them is that this is literally the same conversation that we have been having in our churches for the past, at least 40 years in terms of who should we actually be helping?
Mm-hmm.
But this is also the same conversation we're having right now in terms of, well, what happened, the immigration discussion. They're taking our jobs, our power.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking our resources. Well, what resources are they taking? Do you still have food on the table? And, and it gets real bad when we get into discussions. And Dio, hopefully, if I remember right, you are going to be able to calm yourself enough on air not to jump through the screen and try to attack the person. But, unfortunately, this is also part of the issue we get into is the other side of that. And this is part of the conversation that was in the chat as well, is this idea of, well, no, there are plenty of resources and plenty of power. We've had people in the past couple of weeks that are adamant about the fact that there are no hungry people in America, that kids are fine and that there are no kids that are starving. And so why should we feed them? We have all these discussions where when it's about the people that are already in your community, they have enough so we don't need to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's about other people coming into the community, then suddenly there's not enough. And so now we have to do something.
Man, that's a really great point, man. That's a really, really good point.
And the irony of all of it, and this is something that for some reason it triggered a lot of people on threads that were evolutionists. But I pointed out the fact that the thing that started a lot of the discussion about public schools specifically within churches was the Scopes Monkey trial and this idea of that evolution is coming into the schools to cancel God and to train your children to not understand the Bible and all these other things. But the same people that consistently try to preach that are the ones that are using Darwinism to decide who they should help and who they should not.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's all about survival of the fittest in terms of I need the most resources, the most power, the most opportunity so that I can thrive. And if they can't get it themselves, then they deserve to die out.
Yeah. And that's what all of this is about. Survival. Definitely it's about survival. When the Portuguese started the slave trade, it was about survival. We're going to enslave people so that we can lift ourselves up. And we see Spain, we see Britain, we see the Dutch, we see all of these, we see France, we see these other countries fighting to get on top. We got to make a move before they make a move, and then all of the decisions thereafter, all the way up to 2025 across the world, you see countries making moves for survival purposes, and they're preaching to their people, if we don't do these things, we're not going to be able to survive. And they're showing them these small snippets of instances, and for them it's evidence to prove and substantiate that, hey, we don't get on this, y'all, we're not going to survive. So once you can scare people into making decisions, fear is a good motivator, but it causes people to do some things that should go against their morals, should go against their faith. Right. But that fear starts to even overpower those things.
And that's where, the phrase I use a lot online when we're dealing with these things, when suddenly they no longer want to actually have discussion, they start accusing us of all sorts of stuff. is, it's not my fault you don't like what you see in the mirror. Because what happens when we talk about the questions? Mm-hmm. What happens is eventually what has been down there comes out. And when it comes out and we call it like we see it, it makes people upset. It makes them angry.
Yeah.
Because now their fears have been exposed.
Right.
While you were talking, some came, this idea, it's fear driven, it's survival driven. All these other things, this is really what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13.
Mm.
As to why love is the highest call. It drives out fear. It teaches us patience. It does not envy the status of other people. It doesn't boast in arrogance. It's not rude, not self-seeking, not irritable. It finds no joy in unrighteousness and only rejoices in truth.
Mm.
It bears all things, even when it means that we have to suffer. And in the end, these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. Faith and hope are the opposite of fear, because love casts it out. This is the big thing, especially for those of us that are believers. That's part of why I said what I did before. Nothing that Dio and I are saying here is going to actually change anything within society.
Mm-hmm.
Society is going to society. It's the same thing that when we talk about voting, same thing when we talk about rights and resistance and all the other political stuff that we've ever talked about. The government is going to government. I mean, that's what Scripture says. The government is going to government until Jesus comes. Society is going to society until Jesus comes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about what society and the government's going to do. It's about what we as believers are called to. And we are called to more than living in fear and survival. We're called to living in faith and love and to putting other people first, regardless of what that means for us. The phrase that I use, when I've kind of rephrased Philippians 2, which is what you had quoted earlier, is to say, don't consider yourself more highly than you ought, but instead consider the interests of others as greater than your own. Well, and he then goes on to say, in doing this, take on the attitude of Christ Jesus, who didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, and instead lowered himself. It's not just about, well, if I consider my interests super high, then that just means I have to consider other people's interests super high as well. It's not that. That's not doing what Christ had done. What Christ had done is that he considered others' interests to be better than himself, even to the point of his own destruction.
His own death, right.
That is the call, is that if it will help the other person, even if I destroy myself in the process, that is the call of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that's scary when we already are working on ideologies that are based in fear as it is.
Right.
So hopefully there was education involved with this. Hopefully people, at least if you had never heard this stuff before, you at least have something to look up now.
Yeah. Do your homework. It
literally is that simple. That's literally the if nothing else out of all of this, doing your homework is kind of the end goal here.
Mm-hmm.
Go check this stuff out. See for yourself that we're not making it up.
Right.
And see for yourself that most of the information that we're talking about, you're going to find in hyperlinks in an EDU, not .org or .com or .net or coming off of True Social.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dio, before we go, though, you also have some stuff that you've got going on that we want to talk about as well. So, last time that we talked, you were still head of a school and doing all sorts of stuff. Now, though, you have moved on to another venture. Share a little bit about what it is you got going on.
Yeah, I'm partnering with Cam for All People. We got a summer program that'll be starting June 9th. And Monday through Thursday, ages 8 to 14. I'm calling it the Sandlot Summer. Nice. One of my favorite movies is The Sandlot. And of course, in the movie, for that group, it's just a summer that they always go back to, that they always remember. So I really want to provide this year a summer camp and a summer experience that the kids can, 20 years from now, they can look back to and remember and say that they had a great time. So I got a summer program. In the fall, I'll be doing an after school program. I'll also be doing some mentoring. And I didn't mention it earlier in our conversation, but I don't know when. Hopefully it's the beginning of the summer. It might be at the end of the summer, but I am going to be opening a bookstore. I love books. I love reading. I love education. So I literally have hundreds, I really should say thousands of books. And as much as I love having access to them, I want to give it everybody else access to that same information. So hopefully this summer, the bookstore will be something that we'll be seeing in Canton also.
Awesome. So yeah, those of you that are local, be sure to check out all the stuff we will be posting, because we'll be sharing information about all that as well going on. It will eventually make its way into his guest portal also. We're still working on renovating the Misfits website a little bit to make it a little bit easier to navigate, because it kind of fell into disrepair during all the chaos of last season. But we're working on it. It will be back up, but all of that information will be there as well. In the meantime, those of you that want to stay up to date with all the stuff we've got going on, reminder that tomorrow, Friday, for those of you that are watching live, tomorrow, Friday, Kingdom on the Road, just like always, 10 a.m. Fridays live with Joe and Ant. We are starting out in Judges 5 tomorrow. We'll see how far we get through looking at the Psalm of Deborah and Barak. And continue working our way through the book of Judges. So you can find that here on Twitch. Those of you that are watching live at the moment, those of you that are not watching live, you can find it on any of the Misfits channels, including Twitter. It goes out live on, or you can find it on the Buddy Walk channels, the Love Thy Neighbor channels, the Anthony Wilson channels, Call of a Mentor, Joe's personal channel, my personal, pretty much anything with the three of us and KFM, you'll be able to find all of that. Those of you that have no idea what I'm talking about, because I don't know that we've got that much information now at the end of season 4. KFM Broadcasting is fully up and running now. Go check out all of that, kfmbroadcasting.com. You can find all sorts of stuff, from being able to search through the different shows we've got, to find a show for you, to being able to contact us. We've got written work. There's also the thing that we definitely want everybody to go check out is the prayer portal. So if you are in need of prayer, go to kfmbroadcasting.com/prayer, and you'll be able to fill out a form there. You can give us as much information or as little information as you want. But when you submit that, it will go directly to our prayer team to be able to pray for you. If you want somebody to contact you, you can also leave your information there as well, and we'll get back to you to see how we can continue to work with you and minister with you in that setting. Misfits, I don't think we've actually talked about it on air outside of maybe a little bit when Joe and I did our thing last week. But go follow us on Twitch. That's where we're broadcasting live at the moment. We're going to be doing a few more live recordings through Twitch in the future, just because I found out how easy it actually is. So go twitch.tv/Ministry Misfit, and you'll be able to follow us there. We're slowly building the channel up to be able to do more stuff over there. That's also where you'll be able to find all the Misfits Outdoors stuff that we're doing, as far as me fishing and talking to people and things like that. As well as we're hoping that I may even be able to actually get the Nintendo Switch working with my computer. And then we may even do some gaming stuff with Pastor TC and all of them. You can also go subscribe on all the other channels. You can find that at ministrymisfits.com. If you want to support the show, you can do that in one of two ways. You can either go and join the Misfits Patreon at Ministry Misfit, or patreon.com/Ministry Misfits, or you can support the show by supporting the network and going to patreon.com/KFM Broadcasting. Either one of those will help us out. Dio, thanks for doing this on somewhat short notice.
I really do, man. I appreciate all you do, all your work, man, your wisdom, your humility, man, your boldness. I appreciate you.
Awesome. I appreciate you for doing this, and especially the work you've been doing for the community at large for a long time, but continuing to do the stuff we just talked about as far as trying to educate and provide opportunities and things like that. So again, check out all his stuff. Go to the guest portal, click on his information. You can get that there. And then we'll also be updating people as far as summer camps and bookstores and mentoring and all that stuff for those of you that are a little bit more local. And those of you live, we will see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. for Kingdom on the Road. The rest of you, we will see next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.